we start with a familiar decision that we all make, and it has to do with provision. Economists say that there's no free lunch. Whenever you eat, there's some kind of transaction that's made it possible. And so every ancient city had a marketplace. In fact, archaeologists identify some of the buildings that are still standing in the ruins of ancient Corinth as shops. Tradesmen and merchants would rent them out as a place to live and do business. And so when Paul arrives in town and walks into that marketplace, he has to make a decision about his own provision. That's where we start in Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 4. It says, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them, and it says, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. So Claudius was the Roman emperor, and he expelled all Jews from Rome in AD 49. Now, the Roman historian Suetonius, writing around 70 years later, says that this happened because there were continuous disturbances among the Jews instigated by someone named Chrestus. Most scholars think that's probably referring to Jesus Christ. And if so, it shows that less than 20 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus over back in Palestine, in Israel, in Jerusalem, the gospel had already reached Rome and was provoking angry responses from Jews, similar to what Paul encountered in his journeys. Now, that statement from this historian Suetonius, along with others from the historians Josephus and Tacitus, they serve as evidence that Jesus was a real historical person, not a myth as some critics would claim. There is that historical testimony outside of the Bible. And so, getting back to Acts, as Jews, Aquila and Priscilla were forced to leave Rome. They were probably already believers in Jesus, and they chose to set up shop in Corinth. Right? They made tents. They worked with leather and probably other materials, and demand was probably strong in Corinth. All those sailors coming and going, any of them who chose to stick around for a while might buy a tent. Corinth was also the site of what was called the Isthmian Games, which were similar to the Olympics. It would happen every 2 years. And so those who would come for that might need to buy a tent or have one repaired. Now, aside from just the business potential, Aquila and Priscilla might have also come to Corinth to spread the gospel. Because as we continue in Acts, we'll see that they were committed to fulfilling Christ's mission. Now, of course, the Lord is the one who provides for us in an ultimate sense, right? But he does that through various means, including work. And so Paul decides to provide for himself by working with Aquila and Priscilla. And this verse, Acts 18:3, that we've read is the only passage that tells us that Paul was a tent maker. That was his trade. That was his skill. And so as he starts off his ministry there in Corinth, he's probably spending most of his week working in a shop like we saw earlier, and then taking that opportunity every Sabbath day to meet with the Jews in the synagogue and to reason through the gospel. Now, that decision to work in Corinth is not a haphazard choice for Paul. We look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 11 and 12. He talks about it. He says, if we've sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. So what's going on here? Well, it was common for traveling philosophers and religious teachers to receive financial support from people. And in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul argues that Christian teachers have a right to that. But for some reason, he thought that doing so in Corinth would become an obstacle to his ministry. Perhaps people would assume that he was just in it for the money. Right? They might have seen other teachers come through who were hypocritical, who didn't really believe what they taught, but it was just a way to earn a living. And so as Paul comes, he decides he's just going to work. That's the best option for Corinth. Now, sometimes I've heard Christians talk about secular jobs as a waste of time. And Paul would definitely disagree with that. That's not how he viewed it. We hear it in Colossians 3:23 through 24. He says, "Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you'll receive the inheritance as your reward. You're serving the Lord Christ." And so it's just important to be clear and understand that any legitimate job can be done for the Lord. Diligent work honors our Creator, who worked 6 days and rested on the seventh, right, in the creation account. When we work hard and work well, it bolsters our witness for Christ. Over in Titus 2:9 and 10, Paul says that even slaves who show good faith toward their masters are adorning the doctrine of Christ our Savior. We show the power of a transformed life. Plus, the work you do to earn a living makes it possible to support others in ministry. And I think Aquila and Priscilla are prime examples of that. Now, having said all of that, Paul does seem to shift his focus in Corinth back to full-time ministry at some point. Acts 18:5 says, when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. The New American Standard Bible translates that word occupied by saying Paul began devoting himself completely to the word. He was probably able to do so because Silas and Timothy brought financial support from the believers in Philippi. He talks about that at the end of Philippians, about how they sent support for him. So we're not told how long he worked with Priscilla and Aquila during this time period before Silas and Timothy come, but it was a significant enough choice that he made that Luke thought that we should know about it. So how do you think about provision and work? Do you see your job as part of our mission of spreading the faith? No matter what your job may be, if you're a student or even if you're retired, are you serving the Lord?